Tonight, we're not starting in a palace or a battlefield. We're starting in a graveyard, in the damp, cold earth of a freshly dug plot, under a moon that doesn't care what happens down here. It's the early 19th century, and if you were recently buried in a city like Edinburgh or London, you were, statistically speaking, probably not going to stay there for very long. There was a new kind of fear settling in, not of ghosts or ghouls, but of something far more pragmatic. A fear of the empty hole in the morning, a fear of the missing casket, a fear of the resurrection men. So get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe pull the blanket up a little higher, because we're going to take a very slow, very quiet walk through the foggy churchyards of history, where the commodity wasn't gold or land, but you, or what was left of you. To understand the grave robber, we first have to understand the anatomist, the doctor, the eager medical student. And in the early 1800s, medicine was finally starting to figure some things out. They were moving past the idea of balancing four magical humors and were getting genuinely curious about the actual physical machinery of the human body, where things were, how they connected, what went wrong when a person got sick. This curiosity created a boom in medical schools, and these schools had one non-negotiable requirement. They needed bodies, cadavers, for students to learn on, for professors to demonstrate on. It was the absolute bedrock of a proper medical education. You couldn't just read about a spleen in a book. You had to see it, touch it, take it apart. The problem was the supply, the legal supply, that is. For centuries, the only bodies officially granted to the medical schools for dissection were those of executed murderers. It was written into the sentence. The ultimate posthumous punishment, a terrifying prospect in a deeply religious society that believed in the literal resurrection of the physical body on Judgment Day. To be dissected, to be taken apart and scattered, was to be denied eternity. It was a pretty good deterrent. But then, the 19th century arrived. The population of cities exploded. Medical schools proliferated. And the number of people being hanged for murder, well, it stayed pretty much the same. There was a massive, grotesque deficit. The demand for cadavers far outstripped the legal supply. A single medical school might need 100 bodies a year. The entire British judicial system might provide a few dozen. So an economy emerged, a shadow economy. Because when there's a demand, a market will always find a way to supply it. The price for a fresh subject skyrocketed. Anatomists, who were often respectable pillars of the community, would quietly let it be known that they were paying. Cash, no questions asked. They'd leave a back door unlocked, a light in a window. They didn't procure the bodies themselves, of course. That would be uncouth. They just paid for the delivery. And into this lucrative gap stepped the resurrection men, the body snatchers. It was almost a profession, a grisly, nocturnal, but surprisingly well-organized trade. They weren't seen as monsters, not at first. More like a necessary evil, a macabre public utility. They provided a service that the esteemed doctors desperately needed but couldn't legally obtain. Their methods were efficient. They worked in small gangs, usually 2 or 3. They'd watch the newspapers for death notices and funeral announcements. They'd linger at the back of funerals, noting the quality of the coffin, the depth of the plot, the soil conditions. They preferred fresh graves. The newer the better. They used tools designed for silence and speed. Wooden shovels, which were quieter than iron ones. A special grappling hook made of rope and wood, called a drag, to carefully hoist the coffin out of the ground without breaking it. They were artists of disturbance. They'd place a blanket on the ground next to the grave to muffle the sound of the dirt being thrown up. They'd work with a practiced speed, often exhuming a body and refilling the grave in under an hour. The goal was to leave the site looking completely undisturbed, just a slightly sagging patch of earth. By the time a grieving family came to visit with flowers, they'd have no idea the grave was empty. They'd assume their loved one was simply sleeping. It was a theft of profound intimacy, a violation that the victim's family might never even discover. The resurrection men had a strict code. They took the body, and only the body. They left the shroud, the coffin, any personal effects. This wasn't out of respect, mind you. It was purely practical. Stealing the coffin or the grave clothes was a property crime, which was a felony, punishable by transportation or even hanging. Stealing a body, however, was not technically a crime against a person, because a corpse wasn't considered a person in the eyes of the law, and it wasn't a property crime, because no one owned a body. It was a legal grey area, a loophole you could drive a hearse through. They were only charged with the vague offence of breach of the peace or disrespecting a grave, which usually meant a fine or a short prison sentence. It was just the cost of doing business. Of course, this created a kind of Cold War in the churchyards. The wealthy began investing in heavy stone slabs, iron cages called Morse safes that were bolted over the grave, or even hiring armed guards to watch the graveyard for weeks after a burial. The poor, however, were utterly vulnerable. Their graves, often shallow and marked only with a simple wooden cross, were the low-hanging fruit for the snatchers. It added a cruel layer of class anxiety to the already unbearable pain of loss. Your poverty didn't just haunt you in life, it denied your loved ones peace in death. And the medical schools, well, they didn't just accept this system, they actively perpetuated it. They were businesses competing for students. And a school that couldn't provide its students with bodies to dissect would quickly lose them to a school that could. A kind of arms race developed. The rival schools in Edinburgh, the university, and the private anatomy schools run by men like the famous Dr. Robert Knox were particularly fierce competitors. They would bid against each other for the best subjects, driving the prices higher and higher. This competition didn't just encourage the grave robbers, it essentially guaranteed their employment. The anatomists developed a willful blindness. They didn't ask where the bodies came from. They just assessed the quality. A fresh, intact corpse fetched a premium. One that was less fresh, perhaps a bit decomposed, would be sold at a discount. They were consumers in a market of the dead, critiquing the product. It was all very clinical, very detached. This is the world we need to understand. A world of grim necessity, legal loopholes, and macabre entrepreneurship. It was a stable, if ghastly, ecosystem. The doctors got their bodies, the resurrection men got their money, and the public, though terrified, largely accepted it as a grim fact of city life. A dreadful thing, yes, but what could you do? But ecosystems can be disrupted, and the equilibrium of this particular nightmare was about to be shattered, because two men looked at this established, time-consuming process of digging up graves and decided it was too much work. Why go to all the trouble of digging up someone who is already dead when you could just create a fresh specimen yourself? It was a logical, if utterly monstrous, innovation, and it would all centre on a cramped, dirty boarding house in Edinburgh's Westport district, the kind of place where people came to disappear, and where two men named Burke and Hare would soon decide that the easiest way to get a body was to skip the graveyard entirely. Let's float over to Edinburgh now. It's 1827, a city of stark contrasts. The elegant, sweeping Georgian architecture of the new town, all mathematical